Happy Friday, everyone. It's me, John Lorden, here with another episode of BrainScratch for you. I want to give a very big thank you to James, a good friend of mine, has done some research help on a few cases now. He also helped get me kick-started on the research for today's case. Thank you so much, James. And of course, he made the suggestion for it, which is most important. This is what I consider a bit of an old school BrainScratch. This is kind of one of the topics that I used to do a lot more of. Nowadays, I've kind of slid over into a bit more true crime, but this is kind of what I consider a classic BrainScratch. I hope you guys will enjoy it. Just a little bit different than the type of stuff we've been going over lately. But this mystery starts on a blimp, and our coverage starts at Wikipedia. In the mid-1930s, the Goodyear Aircraft Company built a family of small, non-rigid airships that the company used for advertising the Goodyear name. When the United States entered World War II, the Navy took over the operation of Goodyear's 5 commercial blimps. These were the Resolute, Enterprise, Reliance, Rainbow, and Ranger. These airships were given the designations L4 through L8. L8 of Blimp Squadron ZP-32 was involved in a mysterious incident, and that is the incident we're talking about today. This mystery is typically referred to as the Ghost Blimp. Let's learn more about it. Moving over to popularmechanics.com, here is a picture of the L8. The airship L8 was based at the U.S. Airship Base at Treasure Island, San Francisco, as part of an effort to detect Japanese submarines off the California coastline. The airship was crewed by 2 Navy officers, Lieutenant Ernest D. Cody and Ensign Charles D. Adams. Early on the morning of August 16, 1942, L8 lifted off and headed west towards the Pacific on what should have been a routine patrol. 5 hours later, the residents of Daly City, a suburb just south of San Francisco, were startled by the sight of a massive airship rapidly descending towards a row of houses. The airship crashed, and rescuers discovered the airship empty. That's right. We've got 2 naval officers that go missing despite the fact that their ship comes back. And there's a lot of details we have to go into to try to understand this case. Just to give you a little bit of background here, this is post-Pearl Harbor, and essentially they tried to bring these airships into service to patrol the coastlines. So that's exactly what was going on here. They were looking for primarily Japanese submarines. So very important cause at that time. Of course, the nation was very nervous. We had previous attacks that had happened on the West Coast. So that's why this was deployed. And let me just say, just in case you guys are hearing it, it is pouring outside and it is thunder. There's all kinds of stuff going on out there. So if you hear something in the background, I swear I'm not adding that. That is just the nature of Minnesota. Moving over to aviationoiloutlet.com, let's learn a little more about the 2 men. Cody, the pilot, was 11 years younger than Adams and only had 756 hours of LTA, that means lighter than air, flight time, compared to Adams's 2,281 hours. A lot of experience on Adams's part. Despite his lesser experience, Cody had proved himself a rather capable pilot in April of 1942 when he'd flown L8, same ship we're talking about here, to deliver precious cargo to the USS Hornet. This bumped along his promotion. Ensign Adams, on the other hand, had 20 years of experience with LTA craft. He was a veteran of the Navy's Giant Rigid Airship program and had served aboard Los Angeles, Akron, and Macon. He had even been decorated by the German government for rescuing Hindenburg passengers. Despite his experience, this was his first LTA patrol as an officer. And they make an important distinction there. They talk about the fact that his previous experience was with giant rigid airships. After the Hindenburg disaster, I think that's why these smaller airships came into use, and of course they needed staff for that. So this was his first time being on this type of airship. Essentially, the main difference is that the balloon doesn't have the giant frame that's all built into it. It is literally like a balloon. Once the gas releases from it, I mean, it just turns back to fabric, essentially. So a bit of a difference in terms of the construction. And then, of course, the earlier giant rigid airships, I believe most of them were hydrogen-based, and these balloons were helium-based. And of course, another big learning lesson of the Hindenburg disaster was about how flammable hydrogen is. Moving on to unsolvedmysteries.wikia.com. This was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 1993. Here we see a picture of both Ernest Cody and Charles Adams. These are our two men that are missing. Both were experienced pilots, but this was the first time that Adams had flown in a small blimp such as L-8. Cody and Adams left Treasure Island and planned to fly on a routine maneuver. Their intended flight path would take them across the Golden Gate Bridge, heading towards the Farallon Islands, 20 miles off the coast. From there, they would head north towards Point Reyes and then south along the coastline. And here they've included a map so we get a good sense of what their flight plan was. You can see on the right, they start at Treasure Island, then they go southwest towards Farallon Islands, then pretty much directly north to Point Reyes, and then kind of swoop back in southeast for their final stop before heading back to Treasure Island. So we can see the flight plan there, but unfortunately, they're not going to get to complete that. The first leg proceeded without incident. An hour and a half after takeoff at 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed squadron headquarters at Moffett Field. He stated that he was positioned 3 miles east of the Farallon Islands. 4 minutes later, he called again, stating that he was investigating a suspicious oil slick. This was the last time the crew was heard from. And of course, seeing an oil slick in a particular part of water could certainly be an indicator that you have some type of craft in there. It could be submarine, could be boats. So they definitely were looking for those types of indicators and trying to investigate those occurrences. Jumping over to mysteriousuniverse.org. At the location of the L-8 was the fishing ship, the Daisy Gray, and a Liberty ship, the Albert Gallatin, both of which observed the blimp drop flares in the area and proceed to circle the vicinity, obviously attempting to detect a possible sub in the area. Crew aboard the Albert Gallatin sounded the alarm and manned their positions just in case. The fishing ship basically just pulled in its nets and held in position. The blimp continued to circle the area for a full hour as the ship's crews observed them through binoculars. During this time, the blimp made one very low pass, only about 30 feet over the waves, as if to get a better look at something it had seen, and at this point the crew could clearly be seen within the cockpit. Then at 9 a.m., the L-8 finished whatever it had been doing and headed off north back towards San Francisco, which was a bit odd as it had been scheduled to continue to the Farallon Islands. No explanation as to this sudden change of plans was given over the radio from the crew. Now, from what I understand, they would have also had equipment on board. Basically, almost think of it as like a giant metal detector that they would use to try to detect a submarine in that area. So it's possible that this maneuver they're doing where they're bringing the blimp down to only 30 feet above the waves might be to try to enable that technology to work a bit better. From some information I've seen about that tech, it didn't work great to begin with. It had a very low success rate in terms of detection. And here we have another photo of L-8. Throughout this whole time, efforts were being made to try to make radio contact. Around 9 a.m., radio contact had still not been achieved with the L-8. Search aircraft were sent out to find it, and a general broadcast was made to aircraft in the area, telling them to keep an eye out for the rogue blimp. In response, a Pan American airline pilot reported seeing the L-8 near San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge at approximately 10:50 a.m., at which time it was reported as flying steadily and obviously under pilot control. A bit strange. So now we're talking about the fact that there's a sighting. It seems like it's going back to its location. It actually passed the Golden Gate Bridge at the start of its mission on the way out. Seems like it could be going back to Moffett Field. We've got someone that witnesses it and says it seems like it's under control, but then we have a big question of why hasn't the crew radioed back or spoken to anyone in several hours at this point. Not long after this sighting, at about 11 a.m., one of the Navy search planes that had been scouring the area for the blimp saw it soaring up to around 2,000 feet, which was the limit of its recommended maximum altitude and the point where it becomes dangerous for the craft's gas pressure. The search pilot lost sight of the blimp as it disappeared into some thick cloud cover, but the L-8 was seen again near a place called Mile Rock, this time by an Army P-38 pilot who assumed it was merely heading back to base at Treasure Island. At around the same time, another witness on the ground saw the blimp and later reported that it had appeared to be bent in the middle. After that, at 11:15 a.m., the blimp was seen with its motors off and hovering 50 feet above the water near Ocean Beach, while allegedly quite noticeably sagging. And here we even have a photograph of it. Thankfully, there's a lot of photographs of this, for talking about something from the 1940s. I'm surprised at how many photographs there are of what's going on with this blimp. And here we can see the sagging that it's talking about. Now, I know when I first saw this picture, I was like, well, something is drastically wrong. There had to be, a puncture in it, something. There's some reason why the gas is leaking. But after looking into this case, I've bumped into information that there is actually automated systems there that when the blimp would reach a certain altitude, somewhere between 2,000, I think, and 2,500 feet, automated systems would release some of the gas out of it. So I believe that's why we're seeing it in this state here. The wind then blew the blimp along, and it briefly made contact with the beach before careening off back into the air to smash into a hillside, and that dislodged one of its depth charges before floating off over a golf course. The strange sight of the apparently free-roving blimp floating and limping out of control was witnessed by people all over the area. Now, I've read one article where they said that the depth charge actually went off. I've read several other articles that say, no, the depth charge just fell off, and those charges have a mechanism in them where they will not go off unless they are in water. And thankfully, this depth charge actually wound up on the ground. It was recovered by the military by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on this same day. The L-8 soared off towards Daly City, where it veered so low to the ground that it scraped over the roofs of houses, startling the occupants, as well as bouncing off of utility poles and trees. Finally, the blimp came to a stop by crashing into a house on Bellevue Avenue, coming to rest on the family's car as it slowly deflated from a puncture. When authorities arrived, it was found that there was no sign of the two men that had been aboard. Besides the puncture and some minor damage to the blimp's propellers from hitting obstacles, the ship seemed to be in good working order. A check of the fuel showed that it had plenty, the radio worked perfectly, and the parachutes and lifeboat were stowed in their usual positions, as were the firearms that were aboard. And if I recall correctly, there was a pistol aboard as well as a .30 cal gun. So just a few firearms that were there. And here we actually have a photo of the wreckage of the crashed L-8. And you can see by the time this photo was taken, most of the gas was released. From what I understand, there was local volunteer firefighters that got to the scene. They tried to establish a perimeter. You could see it looks like we got a pretty good job in terms of the perimeter, particularly back here. These people might be a bit close, but a lot of them look like military personnel. And the fire department, the volunteers basically started cutting into the blimp to try to find the pilots, and they thought maybe that they could have been covered up by it. You can imagine, I mean, this thing goes for many, many feet behind it. From what I understand, there's even a car that is under this as well. So very strange that we have no idea where the pilots are. The first person on the scene was William Morris, a volunteer fireman who lived in the house the L-8 crash landed right in front of and had watched the course of the blimp from his front door. Morris rushed to aid the crew, which surely must be inside the gondola of the blimp, but as he approached it, he noticed something a touch unusual. The doors were open and nobody was in the cabin. Let's just go back to the photo real quick. So you can see there's a big side door here, and on top of it being open, you can see it's kind of working against gravity, the way that it opens up. There's a latch that catches if you open this wide enough. So what we're hearing, I really question this, and I've seen some other people kind of debate this. Some people think that when just when the locals saw this happen, that they thought that they had to rescue someone. So they're thinking it's likely that one of them might have been able to open the door. I still don't have a clear understanding. I mean, I've seen it written by people that this is a door that locks from the inside. I've seen reference to some kind of safety bar that might also be part of this that was not in place. If this is a door that locks from the inside and there is some kind of safety bar that was removed, then it's pretty clear that one or both of the men, for some reason, opened this door. But the fact that it is opened and the latch is engaged to actually hold it in that open position is a bit curious to many people, myself included. And I still wonder if that's something that happened from rescuers on the ground. Maybe the door was open, but maybe it wasn't all the way in this open latched position. It comes up as a bit of a question because, according to some information from the Navy on this, there is theoretically no way to do that when this thing is in flight. You can open the door, but to open it all the way and to engage the latch that keeps it open is not possible during flight. So I wish I had some better schematics or details on what type of latch mechanism we're talking about here. But the impression I get is that it's not enough to just open the door and to push it to that spot and there's some kind of automatic catch that snaps on. There must be some type of manual latch mechanism there. Volunteer firefighters tore the blimp's envelope open to see if the crew might somehow be trapped inside, but they were nowhere to be found. Continuing at unsolved.com, we're going to hear about the third man that was supposed to be on that flight and why he didn't wind up there. Aviation machinist's mate Riley Hill was supposed to go with Adams and Cody that morning. Quote, Adams had flown in the large dirigibles. Dirigibles is just basically another word for blimp, but usually the big structured kind, and was thoroughly checked out. But he had never flown in the small blimps. This was an indoctrination flight for him that Sunday morning. Just before departure, Riley Hill was ordered off the blimp for some unknown reason. Hill now believes that heavy moisture in the air was weighing the blimp down, making it unsafe to take off with 3 men on board. So I got out, shut the door, and locked it, and they took off. So I've read several different accounts of this story. All of them seem to come to the same conclusion, that there was something about the weight that was going on. And obviously for an aircraft of this nature, weight is very, very important. But I'm also curious because I don't know how much Riley Hill could have weighed. The mission that we heard about that Cody had done that kind of got him promoted, from what I understand, he was carrying hundreds of pounds of parts out to a ship that was taking aircraft to a carrier. So I'm curious about why this weight limit in particular of just likely a few hundred pounds would have been such an issue. But regardless, it seems like it was the issue that quite possibly saved Riley's life. But his comment here, so I got out, shut the door, and locked it, and they took off. He's pretty clearly saying that he locked it. I don't know if he means that he latched it, but I'm just curious to know about that because I'm still wondering about the fact of this door being open. If there was an actual locking mechanism to it where you needed a key to actually unlock it, that would mean that people on the ground in Daly City that were trying to save whoever was in there wouldn't have been able to open it. If it was simply a latch, then maybe they could have opened it. But maybe this is pointing to what all the articles are saying, that door was essentially wide open when it came down. Now, just in the middle of filming this, I just had a thought. I wonder if any of the pictures of it while it's in flight in that sagging motion show the door open. So I looked through all the photos that I've been able to find, and unfortunately, and it's almost kind of bizarre, every single one is the wrong side of the blimp. It's the side that doesn't have the door, and because of the windows, I don't feel real comfortable trying to deduce if you can actually see that the door is open on the other side. So kind of unfortunate because one of those photos, we know there was many photos taken, could at least answer the question of was that door open all the way to where it was latched open while the blimp was making its final flight back in. But We don't have that answer. Miraculously, no one was injured when the blimp landed in the middle of the street. Almost immediately, Daly City officials were on the scene. When Navy personnel arrived, they were shocked to discover that there was no sign of Lieutenant Cody or Ensign Adams. The door was latched open, which was a highly unusual in-flight position. The safety bar, normally used to block the doorway, was no longer in place, and a microphone hooked to an outside loudspeaker dangled from the gondola. Riley Hill, aviation machinist mate with the U.S. Navy, had prepped the blimp for flight. Quote, "The ignition switch was still on, the radio was still on and working. Nobody had touched my fuel valves. They were set up just the way that I'd left them. We still had another 6 hours of fuel." Lieutenant Cody's cap rested on the instrument panel, and 2 of the 3 life jackets on board were missing, suggesting the crew had put them on before takeoff, as regulations required. A locked briefcase containing top secret codes was still in its place. Quote, "The machine gun was still there. The expandable life raft was still there, as well as 1 more life jacket. There was nothing missing." Very, very bizarre case. Moving over to Skeptoid.com, which I appreciate. Skeptoid does, usually a very skeptical analysis of these things. You might want to give this one a read. As usual, I'm going to have all the links in the description box below. Skeptoid's conclusion on this is a fairly straightforward, that one of them fell out, the other one went and tried to rescue him, and he fell out, and that's that. I have some questions about that we'll get to by the end of this, but let's go ahead and continue with some information from their coverage. Of all the items still on board, the most remarkable was a briefcase of classified documents, which Lieutenant Cody had carried on as was done every day. This briefcase was heavily weighted, and standing orders were for the briefcase to be thrown overboard into the ocean in the event of any emergency. Evidently, no emergency had taken place. What was missing, on the other hand, were 2 of the 5 water-activated smoke bombs the blimp carried, called Mark IV float lights. If you did spot a submarine, you'd toss one of these where you saw it, and it would make a flame and thick black smoke for about 2 minutes. Relieved of the weight of 2 crewmen, the blimp would have risen until it reached its pressure height altitude, which was between 2,100 and 2,500 feet on that day. An automatic vent opened to release helium to keep the blimp from bursting as it descended. So its appearance of being sagged into a V shape was exactly as expected. And even the account of the Mark IV float lights being deployed makes sense. They thought they saw an oil slick. I believe that the 2 boats that were in the area would also be able to confirm the fact that they saw the smoke from the float lights that were deployed. The Navy offered its own best guess for what might have happened. Somehow, Ensign Adams opened the door and fell out. Maybe he was airsick, maybe they were horsing around, maybe he was trying to get a better view of the oil slick, who knows. Well, let me stop there for a second. This is a guy with over 2,000 hours. Him getting airsick at this point in his career, outside of the possibility that maybe he had a flu or something like that, but just genuinely airsick, I don't think that that's a viable option in this case. Maybe they were horsing around. Once again, I'm really not sure about this. Keep in mind, this was Ensign Adams' first trip on this ship. We know that Lieutenant Cody has been flying this ship regularly for a period of time up to this point. I don't even know if these 2 guys really knew each other all that well. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of history that we can look at to determine, did they have a friendship? Was there something going on? Which is another interesting thing, because of the many theories kicking around, one of them is that there was some type of love triangle. Both these men were in love with the same woman. The only information I could find that doesn't really support that is these were both married men, which doesn't necessarily rule it out, but I have not found anything to suggest that there was some type of love triangle and these guys got into a fight and knocked each other out of the door. It doesn't quite make sense to me. Once again, I would think in a case like that, they would see signs of a struggle within the cabin. The possibility that both of them would fall out is probably not as high as one of them being thrown out and then the other person still being in there. So I don't know about these possibilities that are being kicked around here. Lieutenant Cody tossed out the float lights to mark his companion's position, then circled low and perhaps upon finding him, stopped the engines. In some circumstance, while single-handedly trying to control the blimp and retrieve Adams, Cody fell out himself. Perhaps deploying the life raft for Adams would have taken one more hand than Cody had available, and it's not surprising that making a radio report was lower priority than saving your buddy's life. I just don't know that I agree with much of what's going on here. This makes it sound like we're talking about someone that has absolutely no training, no military training, someone that doesn't even understand how to handle an emergency. If you go to any water safety class, the first thing they teach you is if someone is in distress, you do not go in after them yourselves. And they had a deployable life raft. So if Adams did fall in himself, I would think the first thing Cody would probably do, even if Cody did make the same assumption that they're making here, that the radio report was a lower priority than trying to save Adams, I believe the first thing Cody would have done is grab that raft and get it out the window, even before trying to lower the blimp for a potential rescue. And think about that. Trying to bring the blimp down to, I mean, how close are you going to get to these waves trying to affect this rescue? It just, the logic of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Now, from what I understand, there are ropes that are hanging off this blimp. When it came in at the beach, there's reports that some people actually tried to grab those ropes to help bring it in, but it was just too big. There was too much force behind it. They weren't able to do that. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility that in a rescue operation, if there was those, I think they're called control ropes, if I remember correctly. If those ropes were available, maybe he could have tried to lower the blimp to a position where that rope would be reachable. But still, I would not think of doing that until after I had thrown out the raft and the guy was on the raft, and then you're working on getting him back. And by the way, in between all that, raft goes out. The second thing I'm doing is calling it in because you've got boats that are in the area. We know that 2 boats are in the area. They're literally watching what's going on. On top of that, you're part of the Navy. I mean, there's all kinds of resources that could be deployed. So unless the only condition I can think of is if Cody thought that Adams was not conscious. Maybe that would change up the order of events. Maybe that would change up his approach in terms of some type of rescue. But that, once again, makes the feasibility of taking the ship down to his level just even more ridiculous. If it was like that and Cody was going to try to save Adam's life, once again, I would think you would throw the life raft out. And then if you were going to abandon ship, you would do that. But he's got other responsibilities in there. We've got this case of top secret codes that he's leaving that responsibility behind, leaving his military responsibilities behind. I just don't think that their training would allow that to happen. And that's part of why this mystery is so tough to get your head around. There's questions that don't fit the logic of this situation. And even the Navy to this day apparently does not have answers to any of this. So let's take a look. This is at a website called sfmuseum.org, and it is an article that I was able to find about this from the San Francisco Call Bulletin that was published August 18th, 1942. Land hunt for blimp crew abandoned. The Navy has given up its land search for the 2-man crew of the derelict blimp. The sea hunt for the 2 officers is continuing, and they are not conceded to be dead. And this is, keep in mind, this is about 2 days after this happened. A 12th Naval District spokesman said, the land search is completed. The area from the spot where the blimp first touched ground and its final resting place has been thoroughly covered. The Navy is positive the men were not in the ship at any time during its derelict flight over land. Despite what several witnesses say, which we'll get into some of their statements by the end of this video. The men may be somewhere in the ocean, buoy up by their Mae West life belts, or possibly safe on a radio-silent surface craft, it was indicated. If they left the airship at sea, their life jackets would hold them up indefinitely, it was explained. Which once again throws a major question into this. Even if they didn't survive whatever happened, they were both in life jackets. Those life jackets would have kept them afloat, and you had military looking for these guys pretty much from about an hour after they lost radio contact, and then for days after that, and they're never located. I'm telling you guys, just going through it all again here with you now, I have even more questions springing to mind. There's just the logic of what's going on with this case does not make any sense. Some of the theories on this are there was a stowaway aboard the craft, and then they harmed them, took them prisoner, something along those lines, that they did find a Japanese submarine, and the submarine, possibly under threat of fire, was able to get them to surrender in some way. I've seen some mention that Japanese military records have since been declassified or at least reviewed by someone, and that there was no Japanese submarine in that area on that particular day. Could that be true or not? Is there some possibility of some covert operation or something along those lines? I think you'd have to keep that in consideration. But thinking about the feasibility of a submarine overtaking two guys in an airship, in a blimp, that have charges on them, they've got ways to attack that submarine if they do find it. I don't know. I can't imagine how how would the communication even happen for this submarine to say, hey, if you don't get out of there, we're going to kill you guys and come down here. I mean, I don't know. It baffles me. There is one very, very strong article on this. It's written at historynet.com. If you're only going to read one article on this case, I highly recommend that it's this one. It's just the most comprehensive. It's got most of the detail all in one place. You know, I'm kind of bouncing through all these different sources, but there's some not clarifications, but additional details that I want to use this website for to help fill in some of the gaps and maybe help us come to some conclusion on this, though. This has been an unsolved mystery for, I think, over 75 years at this point. So I don't really feel confident that we're going to come to a conclusion on this. Cody, his commanding officer, considered him one of the most capable pilots and one of the most able officers under his command. Nonetheless, Cody was a latecomer to lighter-than-air flight. He hadn't been designated a naval airship aviator until December of 1941, which meant he'd been officially flying for just 9 months. I don't know how strange that is, because there were so many airships being brought in around that period and added to the force that I think there was probably a bunch of new guys that maybe didn't have quite as much experience that were now being put into these positions. L8 had been commissioned on March 5th, 1942. Love 8, as the craft was also called, was a 150-foot-long blimp similar to the type Goodyear flies over athletic events today. Held aloft by 123,000 cubic feet of helium, the blimp had a maximum diameter of 47 feet and a cruising speed of 43 knots. It was powered by twin 145 horsepower Warner Super Scarab Type 5 engines. The airship had a reputation as an excellent flyer. In fact, during its 1,092 trips aloft, it had required no more than the usual maintenance and repair. Inspected 4 days prior to Cody and Adams' departure, L8 was deemed to be in fine working condition. And keep in mind, the inspection, well, at least all the analysis that they did after the fact, it seemed like it was a very solid craft. There was one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but we will. The day was slightly overcast, but visibility was good at 3 to 5 miles. Cody could even see the towers of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. When L8 hadn't responded by 8:50, 2 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher float planes were sent to search for the blimp. So keep in mind that communication happened, I think, around 7:46, if I recall correctly. We're talking about within an hour, we had 2 planes that were out looking for them, on top of the message to all other aircraft in the area to keep an eye out for them. So the search began really, really quickly here, and it just adds to this mystery of where are these guys? How did we not find them? Sunday morning golfers at San Francisco's exclusive Olympic Club stopped to watch the blimp limp by overhead. One club member reported having seen a parachute descending from L8 while the blimp was still offshore. I don't know what we can say about that one. Obviously, it has to be a false sighting. The parachutes were all accounted for. None of them were taken out of the blimp, unless we go with the stowaway theory that there was someone else that was able to stow away in this cockpit, which, look at the size of this thing. I have read some descriptions that there's almost like what you would consider a closet that's kind of built into the back end of it, but this is not a super big craft. I mean, it looks like the actual gondola. I mean, if this guy's 5 feet tall, the gondola is no more than 20 feet maybe in length. You know, if there's a closet in there, could someone have hidden in it? Possibly. But if this guy's right about a parachute, he was hiding in there with a parachute as well. 17-year-old C.E. Taylor told the San Francisco Call Bulletin, "I put my binoculars on it and could see figures inside the cabin." It's strange because even when I look at these photos, I'd swear that there's people in this, not necessarily in the pilot position near the front, but it looks like in the, maybe that's the 4th and 5th window back, something is stopping the light from coming through the other side. And I believe the design of this gondola is the same on both sides in terms of the windows. So I don't know why something seems to be blocking the light from coming through, but it does look like that's happening in there. Could it be a piece of equipment? I really don't know, but in all these photos I'm seeing, something is blocking the light. Could it be that this young man is mistaken and he's actually seeing that same obstruction and thinking that it's people in there? I don't know. Let's get a little more detail here about that microphone system. I know I mentioned it kind of briefly before. Daly City fireman Thomas O'Brien also found the gondola empty, but noticed that the door to the cabin was latched open and the microphone for the Bogenhaler, a loudspeaker system used to communicate with surface ships, was dangling outside the doorway. So if that's specifically true, now we have to imagine a situation where Cody might have been using basically the outdoor loudspeaker system, which you would use to communicate with someone that is more than likely below you, either in a boat or possibly in the water. And then he fell out the door and, you know, took the microphone with him. And then that's how it was found when it floated into Daly City, with the microphone system still hanging out the door. I'm curious about it. It's interesting to me. But once again, with all the activity that was going on with this thing, I mean, it was bumping into cliffs, it was bumping into homes. I don't know that we can assume that that was the last position of the microphone. You know, I mean, it could have been that during one of those impacts, the door actually swung open and the microphone was just rolling around in the cabin and eventually landed out there. I don't know. I'm also curious about how long is the cord on that thing? Is it located next to the door? Because would it be typical procedure for them to be opening the door for some reason when they were doing that type of communication? I don't know enough about their processes to really answer those questions. Once again, a hat belonging to one of the crewmen was discovered resting on the flight controls, and L8 radio was in perfect working order. The engines were in perfect working order, outside of the fact that the propellers had been banged up and one of them was filled with a bunch of dirt from when it ran into the cliff. The ignition switches were on. The blimp's instruments and flight controls operated normally. They still had 4 hours of gas remaining in the fuel tanks. The only thing slightly strange was that the blimp's batteries were drained and part of its fuel supply had been dumped. Normally, a blimp wouldn't dump fuel unless it needed to increase buoyancy in a hurry. Since L8 didn't seem to have that need, it wasn't clear why fuel had been lost and its engines idled. I'm really curious about this detail. It is not a detail that is reported in most retellings of this story. I've seen a few references to the batteries being run down, but not many. But the fuel supply having been dumped, or some portion of it having been dumped, I have not seen that detail in many of these versions at all. And you have to wonder what the heck went on that made them dump part of their fuel supply. I really don't know. I'm also wondering about what systems would have been run by electricity. Like if the batteries were completely out, what systems would that have impacted? Would it have impacted their navigation at all? The radio, I would assume, would be running off electricity. If those batteries were sapped, could it be that the radio actually wouldn't have been able to work? I have a lot of questions about it, but unfortunately, not a lot of details to answer those questions. For the next 3 days, Navy ships and planes assisted by the Coast Guard searched the Pacific, but despite calm seas and good visibility, there was still no sign of Cody and Adams. The Navy notified the men's wives. They were officially listed as missing. I don't get how this happens when we have everyone looking for these guys within an hour of whatever happened. And we've got them in life vests. Even if they couldn't find them in time, I would think that they would have found their bodies at some point, and it didn't happen. Asked whether L8 could have been attacked by the enemy, a Navy spokesman responded, "That's very remote." I think I agree with him. A second spokesman echoed his assessment. Nothing the Navy knows now has given a satisfactory explanation of what happened. 2 days later, the Navy convened a board of investigation under Commander Francis Connell. The 7-day inquiry took testimony from a civilian and naval personnel and eventually established that no fire, no submersion, no misconduct, and no missiles struck the L8. Witnesses from Daisy Gray and Gallatin testified that during the time they were watching the blimp, its crew was aboard. The engines were running, and they saw no one fall from the cabin. So we're left with one giant question. What happened between the last radio contact at 7:42 and when the blimp came down around 11:15? And then we've got all these many smaller questions in there. What actually happened to the men? Did one of them fall out? Did they both fall out at the same time? Were they taken out? What are the answers to all these questions? And if there was an accident of some kind and the radio was working, why didn't the person that was still available to use the radio actually use it and ask for some help? The only thing I can imagine is maybe if there was some type of really fast happening accident. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but literally the main consideration we have here is that one guy fell out the door and another guy fell out right after him. It would have had to happen so fast that Cody wouldn't have had time to get to the radio to report what was going on. That's the only thing that I could imagine in terms of some type of accident going on here. So now let's get into some theories. HistoryNet also reported about Otto Gross, who has been researching the disappearance of L8's crew since 2009. He believes he's found the answer. His theory, detailed at his website, ghostblimp.com, which, by the way, right now is only basically a placeholder page, and all of his old links have been taken down, is that the blimp had been secretly testing experimental radar and poorly shielded microwaves overpowered the men, causing them to tumble out of the cabin. Gross's claim is speculative, however, since no hard proof has ever been uncovered that L8 was testing experimental equipment on the doomed flight. I don't think it's a terrible theory. It's something that kind of comes up in the mysteries that I cover pretty often. Secret government experiment that, affected people in some way. But it might point us towards a different truth. I'm still wondering about those batteries because it seems like they did not expect those batteries to have been run down. That electricity went somewhere. What was going on with that? Are we talking a short that was in part of their equipment? Could it be that they noticed the short in their equipment? I mean, if you had gone through the Hindenburg disaster and all of a sudden you're on an airship and you see sparks flying out of some piece of equipment, are you going to get nervous? I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure I would. So could that have been kind of the catalyst to everything that happened in this case? There's something about those batteries that is really nagging at me, and I wish that there was much more analysis released about that. But unfortunately, there isn't. Instead, we have the internet debating if aliens took them or not, as well as some other things. Let's take a look at suggestions here from wearethemighty.com. Over the years, it has been suggested the two men staged an elaborate desertion plot, or were taken prisoner by a Japanese submarine, or maybe one of the two men had murdered the other and then disappeared. Others have suggested that the two men were killed by a stowaway or abducted by a UFO, or that they simply, somehow, fell out of the blimp. There have even been sightings, including one by the mother of Lieutenant Cody, who claimed to have seen her son in Phoenix a year later, with his eyes looking peculiar as though he were suffering from shock or a mental illness. But all these suggestions have remained just that, unproven suggestions. Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams were officially declared dead a year later. History has dubbed L8 the Ghost Blimp. And there's a picture of the backside of the blimp as well. Really, really interesting mystery. I've seen some other kind of strange questions kick up around this. This is from thenightsky.org. They did a write-up on this as well. Some of the pictures of the blimp do not include the L8 identifier. Some do. Why is that? And as you can see here, in this photo, we got it real clear. There you can see the L8 identifier on the actual blimp, or on the, I guess it's called the envelope. And then in this photo, you can see there is no L8, or it's been covered up in some way. But I'm also noticing that there is a difference. Here's another one where the L8 is on the balloon part. There's also a difference with the paint job on the back at this point. So I believe that it was restored, that at some point after the crash, it was restored, and they likely repainted it at that point. And there might be a pretty reasonable explanation of why they were able to put the number up on it. Here is a picture of many of the different blimps that were in service there from 1942 to 1945. And I cannot find another one that actually has the designation on the actual balloon part of the blimp. They all say U.S. Navy, but they don't have their designations listed on the actual balloon. So why does L8 actually have one? L8 was quickly repaired and resumed duty as a training vessel. So I believe because they knew that its service was going to be used as a training vessel after that, that they likely put the designation on the refurbished balloon, as well as the paint job on the fins on the back that looks considerably different from most of the other stuff. You'd also have to keep in mind that if it wasn't being used in a military combat scenario, a gray color like that would certainly be good in terms of blending in, particularly on the San Francisco coastline where you can have a lot of gray cloud cover and stuff like that. So, you know, having a giant L8 and kind of black stripes on the back fins, maybe not the most discreet thing. However, if it's just a training vessel and you want to make sure that that your military staff knows exactly what it is when it's in use, that might make more sense for them to have put the giant L8 designation on the side of it. But what else happened with it? Let's learn here. When World War II ended, the Navy returned the blimp to the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, which refurbished its cabin and renamed the craft America. The blimp traveled around the nation, televising sporting events from 1969 until 1982 when it was retired. In 2003, Goodyear donated the control car to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it was restored, is now on display in the same configuration and markings it had in August 1942. Here's an actual picture of it. The Navy closed the book on the incident, officially classifying it as 100% unknown/undetermined. That is a heck of a brain scratch. I'll also have a link in the description box below to USNI, that's the U.S. Naval Institute, and they have a 2-minute video on this. It pops up in a couple of other places on the links down below as well. But if you want to check this one out, I'll have it right at the top of the sources. The video is only a few minutes long, but I really recommend that you check it out. It's just a good retelling of this whole story. Might give you a couple of additional details. So this is where I turn it over to you, brain scratchers. What theories do you have on this? Did we cover all of them here today? Are you thinking the stowaway? Are you thinking there is some way that a Japanese submarine was able to get those 2 naval officers to essentially abandon ship? Are we looking at an accident, something that just happened so fast there was no time to respond to it? That's probably the one that I'm leaning towards the most, but I still have trouble with it, knowing that they were in life vests, active searches were going on for days, and nothing was found. And the batteries bother the heck out of me. Why were those batteries depleted? Why isn't there more analysis into why those batteries were depleted? And was that some reason for them to have left the cabin? Was there some risk to them possibly of being electrocuted or something along those lines? Or were they worried about something even worse happening? What do you guys think? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Speaking of comments, before we get to our comment section for today, I want to thank someone that donated through PayPal. Thank you so much to Lori. Hi, John. Thank you for covering cases the way you do. Love the intro. Ms. Mystery. Hey, Ms. Mystery. Thank you so much for the support. I truly, truly appreciate it. And it certainly helps in a very, very big way to keep me here doing what I love doing, but also helping me help other people, which means the world to me. So for comments, we are talking about last week's BrainScratch, the analysis of Colin Madsen. Once again, I just want to give a very big thank you to his mother, Dana, for all her communication over the past several months, for bringing me into kind of their inner circle in terms of the materials they were able to share with me. I also want to thank those of you that understood why I was being a bit protective of those materials, including Dana herself, which wound up responding to some people. There was only a few people that were kind of critical that really wanted to see more pictures. But I had one particular brain scratcher who made a really good point. Once you put those things on the internet, you never know what's going to happen with them. And for me to be a vehicle that facilitates Colin's image being used in some type of horror cringe compilation or something like that would seriously, seriously break my heart. So there are things that I think I need to be very cautious about when it comes to YouTube. And by the way, I don't know about parental controls on YouTube. I don't really trust YouTube's mechanics all that well, in case you guys haven't noticed from other problems that we've had with YouTube over the past years. So I just think it was much safer to handle it the way that I did, and many of you seem to appreciate that, and I really appreciate that. JD McLaren says, I just had a thought. I wonder if he heard something outside and went to investigate. It would explain the no socks and his shoes not being tied, just thinking from personal experience. Really good thought, JD. Thanks for passing that along. And it might also explain why they were able to basically find urine in his bladder when they were processing him during the autopsy as well. So yeah, I think that there's just kind of this assumption that we've made that, well, he went out to use the bathroom. But if I recall correctly, we haven't heard that from anyone in particular. It's not like one of his roommates actually spoke to him and he said he was going out to use the restroom. And according to the information we have from the autopsy, it doesn't seem like he was going out to use the restroom. So that's a very good point. It could be that he heard something outside. Katya Pershutova says, Russian here. This story just breaks my heart and frustrates me at the same time. Unfortunately, police and law enforcement in my country tend to mishandle a lot of cases. They don't even care that much about their own citizens. It's like the more complicated the case is, the more chances it will be brushed under the rug. No one is willing to put in any extra effort, and just the fact that Colin was a U.S. citizen just makes it even more difficult. Hey, Katya, thank you so much for sharing your input on that. And I think that even if you spoke to most people here in the U.S., at least the perception of what's going on with our police forces probably lines up pretty decently with what you're explaining there as well. I just want to remind everyone that it's pretty much a case-by-case basis. All of our police departments out here run fairly independently. There's not a lot of oversight, not a lot of control in terms of processes and standards. So you might have a local law enforcement division that works very well for your community. And even in those cases, you might have specific instances where it seems like there's been a failure of some kind. So it's really, really tough. But this case, it's heartbreaking in so many ways. And the distance between where his family is and where it took place, and just the fact that there doesn't seem to be any mechanics to try to affect some change in what's going on with Russia's view of this case is really, really frustrating and heartbreaking. As a matter of fact, Dana, Colin's mom, replied to Katya, in hopes we can highlight abuse of power by the police everywhere. Thanks for the comments, Dana. Thank you, Dana. And she took time to respond to several comments. On top of that, Gina, who is a friend of Dana's, also let me know I was incorrect about something, and I definitely want to share this with you because it actually raises a bit of a different question. Also, because I'm familiar with Colin's case, I wanted to provide a correction on the washed pants image shown. These pants were a second pair of Colin's pants, only a different color of inserts, blue instead of red, as shown in crime scene pictures. The interesting thing is that the clean pants shown were actually sent home with Colin in his casket to his family. However, they were not the pants Colin was wearing when he died, as you can see in comparing the photos. It was only discovered later when his family traveled to Russia to get the photos and related documents that the ripped pants were hidden from his family, and the clean ones, which were taken from his dresser in his dorm room, were sent as a replacement. I assume to encourage his family to believe that there was no evidence of trauma to his clothes. Also, if the U.S. Embassy will acknowledge the report that Colin was in fact restrained and held somewhere with the obvious police being involved in a cover-up, then it becomes an act of terrorism against a foreign national, which changes the way his death is classified and in fact would at least open up the victim compensation fund to his family. The amount is minimal, but does provide a small amount of compensation to victims of overseas deaths. Also, Russia is still part of the European Convention on Human Rights. Pressure could be placed by our government to reopen this case and assure it is investigated appropriately. How do you receive proper justice if the ones who investigated and closed the case swiftly need to be investigated themselves as to their involvement in the cover-up? Thank you, Gina. Thank you so much for raising that point. And I didn't realize that about Colin's pants. That whole aspect of the story makes the tear in the back of his pants so much more suspicious. And also puts another check in the category of why are things being manipulated. We already talked about the fact that the necklace is not in the photos and is given back to Colin's family by the police. How did they get the necklace? We don't know. But now we're learning that these pants were effectively hidden in some way and then discovered later after the fact. Very, very strange. I can't believe everything that's going on with this case. Seventh Angel AD, reach out to the State Department. It would be a slow process, but it can't hurt to get it started. Gina responded to that as well. The State Department has been involved from the beginning. They offered their assistance in the investigation, but did not hear back from Russian officials. Just a little bit more of the stonewalling that seems to be par for the course with this case. I just want to give a very big thank you to Gina for being so supportive of Dana and Colin's family. I appreciate that there are so many people rallying around them. And thank you for the clarification on the pants. That is just, it still has my brain racing in a completely different direction now. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on this episode of BrainScratch. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you back here on the Lord and Arts channel on Monday with a brand new case crack.